Have you noticed that the term social distancing is actually an incorrect term? If we distance ourselves on every social level, then it's going to do us much more harm. Even more than before, we need social contact with each other. The term was invented in order to try and encourage physical distancing rather than social distancing. And at one point this was realised and some made an effort to try and change the term to physical distancing. But by then it was too late. The term had cottoned on and everyone carried on using the word social distancing. Physical touch is missing at the moment. And for some of you, it may have been many weeks since you last felt the touch of another human being. Whether that's the hug of a friend, the shake of a hand of an acquaintance, or the kiss of a relative. We miss it on a church level, I'm sure. From handshakes to hugs, we're not currently able to express the love that we feel for each other in our church family in a physical way at least. And I'm sure we all miss that. Even me. Well, the story we're looking at this morning expresses a desire for physical touch, as we'll see. But that desire for touch, it was in order to confirm the belief in Jesus and that he had risen again, come back to life, his resurrection. 1 week earlier, it was the morning and Jesus' followers were in great grief. The man that they had pinned their hopes on as being the Messiah, the one that they had loved and given up everything to follow, he was dead and buried, and their hopes seemed to die with him. The reality is that his very death was the purpose for which he had come. And had they grasped that, then their hopes would have been in his death rather than defeated by his death. But if he stayed dead, their hopes would not be fully realised. That Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene, who was one of his followers, came to the tomb and discovered that his body wasn't there. She ran off to tell two of the other disciples, Peter and John, who also came and saw that the body was missing. Mary lingered as the others returned, and then Jesus came up to her, shows her who he is and that he is very much alive. Later that evening, 10 of them were in the room where they shared that last meal with Jesus, and then he was right there with them. He shows them the scars that are in his hands and in his side from where he was crucified. That confirms that it really was him rather than just someone who looked like him. But one of the group of 12 wasn't there. Well, other than Judas, of course, who had killed himself. Thomas, for some reason, was missing. He had yet to see Jesus alive again. And as the others tell him about their wonderful experience of Jesus, he's not convinced. He tells them quite clearly in verse 25. The other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my fingers where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Thomas will not accept that Jesus is alive unless he sees him and touches him, especially those wounds that he's experienced on the cross. But because he had missed out, he's unable to confirm what the others are saying about Jesus. Because of the social distancing with Jesus at that time, he feels unable to believe. Now, for the last almost 2,000 years, Jesus has not been physically with us. We cannot go up to him and ask to see his hands and put our fingers upon his scars. Shortly after Jesus had come back to life, he went back up into heaven where he lives today. But because he is physically distant from us, because we can't see and touch his scars, well, many are like Thomas. Many won't believe in him unless they get some hard evidence. And perhaps at this time of turmoil, you want something of faith a bit more tangible. Even our normal means of encouraging each other in our faith are removed from us, of being with each other, of seeing each other, of hearing other people sing the wonderful truths of Jesus, of comforting each other with a pat on the back or a handshake. All that sense of absence Well, it might allow doubts to creep in. We might ask, is it really all real? How can we know? How can we know that what we believe is true? We might say that absence makes the heart grow fonder, but it can also cause affections to fade if we let them. So we come to the week now, after the week before, where some of these women had claimed to see Jesus and where 10 of his closest followers said they saw him as well. They're in that same room as they were before, that upper room with the door shut. And suddenly Jesus is there. Perhaps he's miraculously unlocks the doors from the outside. But the very thing that Thomas had missed out on in having an experience with Jesus being alive again, he now has that. The very wish that he had to see and to touch the scars of Jesus, he is being granted. And what's more, Jesus actually invites him in to see and to touch his scars. Verse 27, then Jesus said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Jesus actually encourages him to face his doubts with Jesus. Jesus doesn't tell the person who's struggling with doubts to go away. He doesn't fob them off. He doesn't even belittle the doubts that they're experiencing as if they count for nothing. Instead, he engages doubts. He's not afraid of Thomas's doubts. He welcomes him in. But he also doesn't want such a person to remain in doubt. Agnosticism shouldn't be a settled position with Jesus. He challenges Thomas to stop doubting and believe. And when it's so obvious for Thomas, well, of course he stops doubting and believes. Now that might make you wonder about your own doubts or your own uncertainties with Jesus. Well, for one thing, Jesus isn't scared of your doubts, and he would encourage you to engage them with him. But he also doesn't want you to remain in a position of doubt. Now, Jesus isn't suddenly going to appear to you and I and invite us to touch his scars. Since we are distant from Jesus and unable to see his wounds, how might we confront our uncertainty? Well, for that we have the last two verses here, verses 30 and 31. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. We have the accounts of Jesus. We have the Gospels. They were written by those who saw Jesus or by those who knew people who saw Jesus. They were people who actually saw the things that he did and heard the things that he said and got very close to him. They weren't written down hundreds of years later. They weren't passed down by word of mouth over a long period of time. They weren't fabricated or changed. They weren't manipulated by the institutional church or by the Emperor Constantine. The accounts of Jesus are eyewitness documents. They're faithfully preserved to explain who Jesus is and to encourage you and I to believe in him. They're not neutral, but very few things are. Even their non-neutrality doesn't diminish their truthfulness, though. When you look into the evidence for the gospel accounts being reliable, the evidence is simply overwhelming. Now, since we live in a time of social distancing from Jesus, we have what is written about him, so that we might overcome our doubts and so that we might believe in him, and by believing in him, so that we might have life. It's vital, though, that we understand what is meant by belief here. You see, we tend to think of belief as something that is in our minds, based on a hunch. So we think belief is necessary when we can't be sure of something, when it's not based firmly on evidence, when it's just an opinion in your head that doesn't really change much at all. Except that kind of belief isn't what is being talked about here. Here, the belief that John talks about is about belief that is evidence-based and life-changing. If you look into the evidence for the gospel accounts being true, the evidence is overwhelming. Not only that, but if you look at the evidence for Jesus not only having died but also came back to life again, the evidence is huge. But to believe, even based on the evidence, it is not just something that is in your head and stays there, but it should be something that changes the way a person lives. Apparently in the LA police, they would get new recruits to see the value of the bulletproof vest by putting them on a mannequin and shooting a few rounds at the mannequin, hitting the bulletproof vest. They can then see for themselves that the vest protects the mannequin from harm. However, the real test of belief was when they asked the new recruits to actually step in for the mannequin and wear the vest themselves and have a round of bullets shot at them. Such belief ensured that the recruits would wear the vests themselves when facing combat. And that's what belief is. It's to know something to be true in your mind based on the evidence, but for that then to change your life according to what you know to be true. There's even more than that though. To believe in Jesus based on evidence, having it change your life, it actually brings you to a new life in Jesus. It brings you to a newness that is in your life now, but it also gives you a life that cannot be overcome by death. Just as Jesus, after he died, was brought back to life again, so for everyone who believes in Jesus, there is the promise that they will not be overcome by death. Even though we die, we will live with him forever in a new heavens and a new earth, a perfect new creation. Back with the story. And after Thomas has finally come face to face with Jesus, what's his reaction? Well, Thomas's response is in worship of Jesus. In verse 28, he says, "My Lord and my God," as he speaks to Jesus. He recognizes that Jesus is God himself, even having taken on human nature. He recognizes that Jesus has the right to speak into his life and to direct him in everything as he is Lord. When we come to believe in Jesus, it causes us to overflow in worship. We declare who he is in song and in prayer. We recognize him as our Lord by listening to him and following him in everything that we do. One more thing though. What would you fill in the blank with for this sentence? I'd only believe in Jesus if. What is your if? For Thomas, his if was if he could see and touch the scars from his crucifixion. But what happened to Thomas's if when he was faced with the truth of Jesus himself? Even though Jesus invited him to come and touch his hands and his scars, it doesn't tell us that Thomas did. It seems that he didn't need to. And it's so often the case that when people come to Jesus with their ifs and they begin to explore about who Jesus is in the Bible, so often those ifs that people start with become irrelevant as people are overcome by the wonder of who Jesus really is. If you're in a position of doubt with your if, why not start looking into who Jesus is in the Bible? Why not read through the Gospel of John and consider who Jesus declares himself to be there, who he shows himself to be? We certainly all feel the effects of social distancing today. Maybe it's affecting our faith as well. Maybe we feel that sense of longing to be with Jesus himself, longing to be close to him and to feel his touch upon our lives. Well, one thing we can do is to read of Jesus in the Bible and therefore stay close to him. It will keep encouraging us to the kind of belief that is our whole lives given over to him. It will cause us to overflow in worship where we declare Jesus to be our Lord and our God. But know that this social distancing from Jesus is only a short-term thing. One day, for all who believe in him, we will be in his presence, whether because of our death or because of his return. We will be face to face with Jesus. And in that time, we will know life even more than we know it now. Life that is in his name.